No. We haven't gone that far.
Okay, good.
We doing okay, Bobby? Good. All right. Well, let's dive in then, I guess. Thanks for being here. So this is, I think, our third week in philosophy. We started out with epistemology, the study of what is truth and knowledge, how do we know things. And then last week we started into a metaphysics topic, which metaphysics can be a lot of things. It's sort of studying the ultimate nature of reality, what exists, how is it structured. And so our first metaphysics topic was the existence of God, philosophical arguments for and against the existence of God. And so this week we're planning on focusing primarily on free will, which I think can be a more hairy, tangled philosophical topic than might seem at first if you haven't thought about it philosophically before. So our quote of the day is from Immanuel Kant: "Metaphysics is a dark ocean without shores or lighthouse, strewn with many a philosophic wreck." And I think that just sort of expresses a pretty broad perception that metaphysics is like a really debated area, a really controversial, difficult area of philosophy. There are other things where it seems like we can all kind of agree to some common sense assumptions or whatever, but metaphysics, more and more philosophers have just had bitter debates about it. And we talked about the logical positivists, I guess, week one. They basically said we shouldn't do metaphysics at all. It's kind of worthless. It's meaningless. But if you're even just doing science, you're making metaphysical assumptions about the nature of reality and whether we can know it. And so whether you want to do metaphysics or not, you have to make some sort of assumption about what the nature of reality is and whether we can perceive it and that kind of thing. So this week, like I said, we're going to talk about free will. So we're going to start with two of the sort of most opposed viewpoints. One is hard determinism, and the other is libertarian free will. And we're going to talk a little bit about what free will would even be, like what does that mean, how you define it, and then how do we know whether we have it or not. And so determinism in this sense, we're not yet talking about whether God causes everything. We're just talking about whether things are determined in any sense. And so this can be a kind of simple causal determinism, which means the basic nature of cause and effect. The rules of physics, the rules of nature mean that one thing causes another, and if you understand how cause and effect work, you can know what's going to happen next. And therefore, things are determined by the fundamental nature of things. So that's actually a very common assumption among atheist philosophers. It's a fairly common assumption among scientists, whether they're atheist or Christian or theist. That's been a very common position to take, even though some of its conclusions can be a little bit disturbing, and we'll think through whether we're comfortable with them or not. And so last week with the cosmological argument about whether God exists because the universe needed a cause, we talked about that idea of universal causation. Do we think that everything has a cause? Does everything have a reason that causes it? And if you think that everything is caused, you can, through that alone, essentially get to a conclusion like this, seeming logical. And so it's kind of the idea that, like, picture a billiards table. If you hit the cue ball at a certain speed, at a certain angle, if you understand physics and geometry, you can predict where it's going to go. If it hits another ball, what angle is that ball going to move at what speed? And you can predict what's going to happen. And we've made very realistic computer simulations of pool games. And if you do the same exact shot in the same exact way, the same thing happens, right? I mean, now some things can be really sensitive. So if you change the angle or the speed just a little bit, you get a different outcome. But if it's literally the same exact thing, you get the same outcome, because that's how cause and effect works, right? If you do the same thing, you get the same result. And so this view is essentially the idea that the entire universe works that way. We can predict how pool balls are going to move on a pool table. We know how physics works. We know how cause and effects works. Everything is really ultimately the same. Now, human behavior is more complex. We don't always understand the reasons. We may not be able to predict even the weather, but we know that the weather is caused by pressure and humidity and wind and temperature, right? We know what causes things in the weather. It's just so complex that we can't actually model it well. But we still believe cause and effect, right? And so determinism says, if I Well, let's say Garrett has a test on Monday and he decides he's going to deliberate, should I cheat or should I not cheat? And he has reasons, right? Not cheating, he likes to think of himself as a good person. We've raised him well. He could get caught. But cheating, like, he really wants to get good grades. It would be easier. Wouldn't have to study as much. Whatever he ultimately decides, we might say, well, it was caused by those reasons. And why did he want good grades? Why was it hard to study? Well, those had reasons, right? He was caused, those reasons had reasons, right? We put pressure on him to get good grades. The school did this and that. And, well, why did that happen? Well, they had reasons. And so if you think that everything is caused by reasons, it can be this like chain that goes back in time of those reasons have reasons and those reasons have reasons. Ultimately, the reason Garrett did or did not cheat on that test goes back to reasons before he was even born, right? And one thing caused another, like pool balls hitting pool balls. And so it just caused the outcome. So that's sort of determinism. I don't know, Garrett, y'all have talked about this a lot in school. Is there anything I missed that you think is key to like the basics of determinism?
So for determinism, it's really just that everything has a certain nature. If you think of like the fundamental like laws of nature, you can think that you can't really break those laws. So if you understand those laws fully, you can understand how everything will react to those laws. So like the pool ball example was a good one, like physics and geometry. The pool ball isn't just going to randomly turn left for no reason. You hit it in a precise way to make it do something. But the hard thing that this really, the problem with it is like human nature is so complex, and can you really say that's free will at all, or is that just not free will? And so it's not free will, really, because if everything is caused, you don't really have a say in what you choose or what you don't choose. It's kind of all an illusion. I can try to pretend that I have a choice and say cheating on the test or not, but if everything is caused, then things that I didn't have control over had like effects on me before I could understand that. And so that's kind of like the butterfly effect. Like if you were to change something like if you went back in time and changed something super little, just like killing a butterfly, that could drastically alter basically what the present would look like. And that's because if everything is so essentially built on what everything else is, if something causes something that causes something, if you take a butterfly out before it has the chance to like cause something, that's going to cause a massive chain reaction, like a domino effect. So it's like all life is kind of a domino effect. But the question is really like, what was the first domino that kind of, and what caused that? Yeah.
So what do y'all think? You buy determinism? You think everything is caused in a way that if we just knew all of the facts of the universe and all the laws of nature, we could predict the future because we can predict how pool balls move and dominoes fall?
Personally, I kind of feel like I always talk myself into a corner. I think like you said, then you can, go back or alter or change, or why didn't, it's like the person that doesn't get on the airplane that crashes, those kinds of things. And then they say, why me, but why them and not me kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And did I have control of that? Did I not have control of that? Kind of thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. So determinism is a little bit different than fatalism, but they're kind of related. And the thing that I think is kind of funny about fatalism is it's the idea that at least certain outcomes are fated to happen no matter what we do. So the reason I like it is the classic story of fatalism. I'm going to get all the names wrong, but I think it was like a Middle Eastern proverb or story where this guy sends his servant out into the marketplace, and while he's in the market, he bumps into death. And death gives him a weird look, and he thinks, oh no, I'm going to die, like death gave me the weird look. So he goes back to his master and he says, I've got to flee. And so he gets a horse and he rides all the way to Babylon that evening, and he says, I've outrun death. And then the master goes down into the marketplace and death is still there, and he's like, hey, why did you give my servant a weird look? And he said, oh, it wasn't a weird look, it was a surprise look. I've got an appointment with him in Babylon tonight. And so it's like he thought he had free will, but no matter what he did, he was going to be in Babylon that night, right? And death was going to meet him. So, and yeah, I mean, when we try to think about either causal determinism or fatalism, we can talk ourselves in circles about what was the reason and did I influence it or not. Yeah.
Is there a name for something in between the two?
Yes, there is. So, I didn't even plant that. Okay, so libertarian free will is basically the idea that my decisions are not caused, they're up to me. And that's sort of where it stops. My decisions are up to me, I have free will. So we're going to talk a lot more about what that really means, but that's sort of the idea. So then in the middle, I call it compatibilism because that's how I learned it in college over 20 years ago, and I think it describes well the fact that it's the idea that free will and determinism are compatible. It's also called soft determinism, which I think is what Garrett's school calls it more often, because the idea is hard determinism says cause and effect determines everything, and that means you don't have free will, just suck it up. Like it's an illusion, just deal with it. Soft determinism says, well, yeah, everything is caused, but we can still call that free will. And so it's kind of like a softer way to it, but it says they're compatible. So what do y'all think? I ended it. How would you think through what free will is and whether we can have it if cause and effect determines things, including our actions? What is free will to you? What do you think it would mean for us to act freely? If Garrett decides not to cheat on the test on Monday, like what does that mean that it was his free will to do that?
We make choices.
Yeah, so he has an ability to make a choice. How would you know if you really made the choice or not?
Well, I'll give you an example of that. Back when Buddy Holly was killed on that airplane in 1959, Waylon Jennings was going to get on that flight.
Okay,
And he decided at the last minute not to.
yeah.
And we would have missed a lot of West Texas philosophy if it wasn't for that.
Yeah.
So I kind of think about Adam and Eve,
Okay,
that free will. 'Cause
yeah.
for our lesson in life, that we know they had a choice, but then again, they were told, they also had boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
So making choices has to do too with boundaries with right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you still have that freedom to choose.
Yeah, yeah. So right and wrong is an important consideration here because one of the things we're going to talk about is do each of these three allow for moral responsibility or right, or not? Is our action right or wrong under each of these three viewpoints or not? Or does one of them not really allow for true moral responsibility or more than one of them? Okay, so let's think about this. I'm going to try to define how compatibilists think about free will first, and then we'll think about whether there's anything missing from it. So compatibilists say, yeah, of course everything's determined. We know how cause and effects works, like things are determined. But if you think about how we really use the word free will, that can still be compatible with determinism. So think about Gandhi fasting. Why did he fast? Well, he was protesting British rule in India. He decided this would be an effective way to try to make change. He chose to not eat, right? Now think about somebody starving in the desert. Is not eating for that person free will? No. Why not?
No choice.
Yeah, there's no choice. So they are in some sense externally constrained. So if they wanted to eat, they would be unable to eat because of some external constraint. So what a compatibilist basically says is if you do what you want to do, if your action is consistent with your desires, Gandhi desired to not eat for a reason, and you're not externally constrained, such that if you wanted to do something different, you would do something different, then your action is defined to be free. That is free will. So if Garrett wanted to leave this class right now, but I had chained him to the chair, we might say, well, he can't act freely. You've constrained him, right? But as long as he's not chained down, if he desires to leave, he'll leave. If he desires to stay, he'll stay. That's free will, right? So compatibilists say, well, that's fine with determinism. Like, We know that things have caused him to want to stay in the class. Things could have caused him to want to leave. His outcome is still determined, but he wasn't constrained by something other than his own desires. So what philosophers would call the proximate cause, like the most direct, most recent cause, is internal to him. So it's still cause and effect. Everything causes something else, chain of dominoes. But the most recent cause to his decision to stay in here is his internal desire to stay in here. And that is enough to call it free will. So what do you think? Can we have determinism and free will?
One of the things I think about is if you include God in that whole thing, we have choices, but God's an all-knowing God, so he knows what choices you'll make. So is that already been determined? That you did choose that, or is that really your free will?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Probably one of the hardest questions.
That is one of the hardest questions. And I want to talk about it more. Welcome to take comments on it now if y'all want, or I think we might be able to dig in a little deeper after we do another step or two on the difference between libertarianism and compatibilism, because your view on God's free will might differ between the three a little bit as well. Okay, so let's do another metaphor or two. So one of the ways libertarians talk about what it means to have free will is an image of a garden of forking paths. That means I'm walking through a garden on a path, and I get to a decision, am I going to cheat on this test or not? And I can either go left or I can go right. And so to them, free will is in the moment, I have more than one actual possible choice. I really could choose to cheat, choose to not cheat, and I pick a path. To libertarians, that is free will. I have to have the ability to do it. This is pretty closely correlated, I think, to the idea of moral responsibility, because we haven't gotten to ethics yet, but there's a common idea in ethics that ought implies can. So if I say, I don't know, what's a good example? I'm going to keep using you as the examples in my, let's say there's something Garrett should do right now. He should be on time to church because it's youth-led worship. So he's supposed to be there at 10 o'clock. He has a moral responsibility because he promised Brandon he would to be there at 10 o'clock. If I've chained him to this chair and he literally cannot move, and then Brandon gets mad at him for being late, and Garrett says, I couldn't come, I was chained down. And he said, it doesn't matter, you were morally required to be there, so it's immoral for you to have not been there. We would probably say, that's kind of stupid, like he couldn't. Like, to say he ought to have been there on time implies that he could have been there on time. It's not immoral if he couldn't have. So libertarians say, in order for me to decide to cheat or not to cheat, in that moment, I have to be genuinely capable of both cheating and not cheating, or else I'm not morally responsible. Compatibilists and determinists, though, have a hard time with that idea because they think whether he's going to cheat or not cheat has already been determined by the domino chain of cause and effect. So I don't know if y'all are familiar with labyrinths. I think that they have become more popular with like spiritual disciplines now because there's this idea that you can walk a labyrinth and say a prayer or something. But a labyrinth looks like a maze, except that once you get started, there are no turns, no choices. There are no forking turns. So this is a labyrinth. If you come in and turn left, this path goes all the way to the center, but there is never a choice. You have to turn right, you have to turn left. It's one continuous path the whole time. There is never a fork or a turn or a T-intersection or a branch. All right, so that's different from a maze because with a maze, there are forks. There are turns, right, that you can choose. So a libertarian says we have to have actual forks in our path. We have to have choices where we could do both within this real universe. We could do both. And a compatibilist and a determinist would say, you're really walking a path that was set for you before you were born. I know it feels like you make choices, but you turn right because you were determined to want to turn right. If that's true, do we have moral responsibility? I think is the big question. I see at least one shaking of the head. What is it? What do y'all? Anybody want to venture a out loud comment on whether you think we can have moral responsibility under different views of cause and effect? And
Sort of what it sounded like is that you using your free will to accept the determinism You determined this.
Sort of, yeah. So I think some compatibilists or soft determinists would say you wanted to cheat on the test because of the pressure to get good grades. That was caused by prior experiences about the importance of getting good grades. But nobody forced you to. You did it because that was your desire. You did it because that was your want. So it was a free choice. But if we were able to pause the universe, so those of us that are old enough to have watched VHS tapes, Be Kind, Rewind. If we could pause the universe and rewind to that moment and then replay, you would always make the same decision because you were always determined to want to cheat and you were always going to cheat because that was the... So if you rewind the universe and replay it, always the same outcome because cause and effect determines the same outcome. For compatibilists, that's enough. For free will, they say, well, you wanted to. It was your desire. But libertarians say, but if you had to have that desire since the foundations of time, how is it up to you? In what sense is it really up to you?
It sounds like Groundhog Day.
Yeah, kind of.
Dad, I don't know how you learned it exactly. I think this is what you've been saying, but like determinism is everything's determined just by pretty much everything. But compatibilism is more just by want and desire. So if we talk about sufficient cause, is there anything sufficient to make you choose something? And that would be your want or desire. And so to kind of defend the compatibilist a little bit, basically what they're saying is free will is you have the ability to do what you want. And that sounds like free will if you were to tell Everett, well, you can do whatever you want. He would say, well, I have freedom then.
Yep.
But that it then goes a little bit deeper than that because if it's always doing what you want, can you always really control what you want? That's the real question. Because always doing what you want can be free will, and that's what a compatibilist would say. But libertarians would say that's not free will. You have to always have a choice no matter what. There's no sufficient cause at all that can determine what you're going to do. And so the compatibilist, in their defense, is just saying that you do have free will. You have the ability to choose. You just have the freedom to choose what you want to do always. And so that does get a little bit difficult when it comes to cheating on a test or not. But it's like, do you want to cheat on a test or do you not want to cheat on your test? Yeah. And if I said, like, I feel like I want to cheat on the test because I want good grades, but I still don't, they could say, well, you really wanted to satisfy your morality more. Like, it's which one do you want more? Do you want good grades more, or do you want to be a better person more?
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, question. So whenever we talk about these scenarios, it is like individuals, yet we live together, so wouldn't your free will also be the cause and effect of maybe somebody else's?
Mm-hmm.
So how do they deal with that situation?
You don't have the free will to be born into the family you want.
Yeah, I had a teacher in high school
That's
that
another discussion,
admitted to
right?
us that she joked with her parents that whenever she did something bad, she would say, well, do you think that was nature or nurture that made me do it? Because either one was her parents' fault. Yeah, I think our complex interactions in a community is part of what makes cause and effect so complex and so multifaceted. I think the reason that philosophers usually get down to individual choice is trying to understand, irregardless of all the effects on me, when the moment comes to make a decision, do I honestly have more than one possible choice, or has that already been set? And it could be set by the influence of other people on me. But can I still choose something different or not? So yeah, to me, I want to make a distinction between something that is bad in terms of not achieving a purpose or an outcome well versus something that is morally bad. And I think those are different. I'm not sure if compatibilists do or not. So again, let's say that Garrett cheats on his test on Monday. Is he morally responsible for that? I think a compatibilist might say, well, he was free to do what he wanted and he wanted to cheat, and that's a bad want. And so, yeah, he made a bad choice. But if you believe in, I think, determinism or compatibilism, either way, you're going to say, well, but he, from the foundations of time, from the moment of the Big Bang or God's creation or whatever, however you want to describe it, he was set to want that. Like he was going to want that no matter what, because it's one big chain of dominoes. So to me, now I'm going to feel bad using my own son as this example. That makes it feel like something about his nature that was just created before he was ever born to make choices was just bad in a dysfunctioning way, but that it wasn't up to him, right? So let's say I'm a potter and I'm making a coffee mug, and when I'm done with the coffee mug, I poke a hole in the bottom. And then the next day I try to drink coffee and it spills all over me and I get mad. And I say, this is a terrible coffee mug, it spills coffee. It is accurate that that is a bad coffee mug. Coffee mugs are supposed to hold coffee. It does not hold coffee. That's a bad outcome. It is bad as a coffee mug. Is it an immoral coffee mug? I think not. It was not up to the coffee mug whether it had a hole in it or not, right? And there are people that believe that on the determinism side. So I forgot to look up the name of the book, but there's I think he's a psychologist or something. He's like a scientist of the mind in some way, neuroscientist or psychologist, that has recently written a book where he says we have no free will. And I don't know if he might be open to the idea of compatibilism, but he's basically saying things are determined. And he says, therefore, punitive punishment is a meaningless concept. We should never punish somebody because they made an immoral choice. He said, now, if somebody is a serial killer and we want to put them in jail, that's fine. If you had a car with bad brakes, you would take it off the road. They're a broken person. We don't want them out in public, but they're not immoral. It wasn't up to them. So he is very honest about the implications of at least this end of the spectrum. I would say it applies in the middle, but yeah, to Garrett's point, I'm probably not unbiased here. I have a pretty strong opinion on this. But at least this end of the spectrum, that is the logical conclusion. Nothing is anybody's fault, and immorality makes no sense. Hitler was just going to be Hitler from the foundations of time. He had no choice in the matter. We would all want to disable him. Right? We don't want coffee mugs with holes in the bottom, but he didn't choose it any more than any of us choose anything.
Sounds like chaos.
Yeah.
What about in the Bible? I've always wondered, like, when Pharaoh kept having opportunities to the Hebrews, though, you know where I'm going with this.
Yeah, I know where you're going with that.
So, okay, but he had doubts and he kind of wanted to let them go, and it says God hardened his heart.
Mm-hmm.
That's not from his birth.
So I'm very tempted to say what Rob Sutphin said in a class when people brought up that thing and said, I'm just not going to touch that with a 40-foot pole today. He just refused to address the issue. Now, I think Pharaoh is a very difficult biblical question. And I think the language evolves a little bit from Pharaoh hardens his heart to Pharaoh's heart is hardened to God hardens Pharaoh's heart. I don't know what that all means. The one thing I'll say, which you're probably not going to like, but this is the philosopher's answer, is to be a libertarian, you do not have to believe that every choice we make is free. You just have to believe at least one choice is free. Because if you're a determinist, it means literally zero choices are free. So libertarians believe that free will is possible, that free will exists. They don't necessarily believe everything is free will, right? And so if somebody who's addicted to tobacco smokes a cigarette, we might all say that wasn't really free will. And that's fine, right? Or if I just go on autopilot and I drive to work and I didn't even remember how I got there when I show up, I'm like, well, oh, here I am. Some of my decisions may not have really been free will. They were just my subconscious. You can believe we do things automatically without thinking, but as long as you believe we at least sometimes act freely, you would be a libertarian. And so even if God, for whatever reason, chose to take away Pharaoh's free will, you could still believe, but free will exists. That's just an example of God doing something special. But why God did it, I don't know.
So where did the fruits of the Holy Spirit, the fruits of the Spirit come in?
Yeah. Where do you think they come in?
Well, sorry. Well, I just remember, you'll know this guy's name, but he is a Catholic priest in LA who helps.
Oh yeah, the Homeboys Enterprises thing. I
Yes.
can't remember his name off the top of my head. Yeah.
But anyway, he doesn't get mad when they get addicted again. He's just, and he doesn't say that it's anything about their choice, because he says God has goodness in all of us. It's just, do you choose to continue to recognize that goodness and just say, come back when you're ready. I always know there's good in you.
Yeah. I think that, personally, I think that's an example of, even if libertarianism is true, many of our actions may be much less free than we think they are. So like I've heard Richard Beck, the chair of the psychology department at ACU, say, we're probably much less free than we think we are. I don't think he means there is no freedom. I think he's just acknowledging we are impacted by powerful forces. So yeah, Garrett, you said something earlier about like, it was the cheating thing, like there's going to be reasons on both sides, right? Yeah. So one philosopher that I've heard describe this, he's a libertarian, he thinks the way free will works, this is the hardest thing about free will. One of the reasons it's like a tangled knot in philosophy is, even if you believe in it, describing how it works is virtually impossible. Because you either have to resort back to cause and effect logic again and say free will is caused by this, which gets you scarily close to here, or you end up kind of feeling like it's just a throw of the dice. Like, and randomness doesn't really get us to free will either, although remind me to say something about Epicurus. If we don't, I still think that's fascinating about randomness. But so what, the guy's name is Robert Nozick, I think. What Robert Nozick says is, of course there are reasons that influence us, but free will is the ability to change how we weight those reasons. So I want to get good grades, I want to go to a good school, I want to not study as hard, but I want to be a good person, I want to obey my parents, I want to, you know. Well, so you have reasons to cheat and not to cheat. When it comes down to it, which one's going to get at least 51% of your vote, right? And Robert Nozick says, of course we're influenced by reasons, but we get to, when we can act freely, we get to re-weight which ones are more important to us. We decide what kind of person we want to be, right? We decide what we value and we re-weight things, and that's free will. If I'm addicted to nicotine, taking that cigarette, it may be a 90% chance whether I like it or not, and then just my free will is not enough to get not smoking over 51%. Like I'm not going to do it. The other thing that I think is interesting, I heard one philosopher on a podcast recently talk about, there's always a probability that we're going to do something, but our probabilities in the future are impacted by our prior behavior. So if somebody starts making some good choices when they can, that reinforces their desire to make good choices. It makes it easier to make good choices in the future. And so even if we're not always 100% free to do anything, when we exercise our free will, it impacts our future ability to act freely.
As habit.
Yeah. Yeah, which we might get to in virtue ethics when we get to our last 2 weeks on ethics. I don't, does that help at all with, I can't even remember the question now.
I mean, I guess it also goes
Oh,
into
the
behavioral.
Yeah, the like addiction stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, because, I mean, there's so much like how to do your behavior, and it's, as long as the result is a positive one, that's where you're going to go in your behavior. So,
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm saying. I guess, have we talked about how behavior?
There's a lot of interesting things about behavior, because immediately I start to think about like Plato and Aristotle, because Plato says behavior is always something that has to do with the mind above all else. If I was, to use the nicotine example again, if I was addicted to nicotine, Plato would say, well, just think it's bad. And if you think it's bad enough, then your actions will always follow your thoughts. So if you're addicted to something, it's just a mental problem. But Aristotle says your mind and your actions can be out of sync. So the question is then, like, how do you get them back into sync? And Aristotle would say habit. And he would say there's three things. There's your thought, there's your like soul, and then there's your actions. And at some point, each of them have to change in order to completely change like the habit. And so pretty much everyone can agree that first your thought has to change. You have to realize you're doing something bad. You have to accept this is wrong. And then the real question is then, like, does your soul or your want come next? I think this is bad, therefore my soul really wants for this thing to change, and I really truly want to change in my heart. Or does your action come first? Do I realize this is bad, so do I start doing habits to try to fight against that, and once I've done the habits, can my soul change? And so that's kind of the question then.
Good, I've never had any experience that way.
That's why I bring them along. Maybe let's get back to God's foreknowledge, but I've got We only had 2 slides today. I want to go ahead and show you the next one, even though I think we've already talked about it. This is how compatibilism thinks of choice. Gandhi wanted to fast, so he fasted. He was always going to fast because he was always going to want to fast. History is a straight line of cause and effect. It couldn't have been different. Now, in a different universe, if he had not wanted to fast, he wouldn't have fasted. That's free will. He did what he wanted. But those 2 lines will never meet, right? Now, how libertarians think is David suggests that we should all consider fasting as a spiritual discipline. I don't really like it, so I think about it, I deliberate, am I going to go along with BAML this week and fast or not? And then I make a decision. I can either fast or not fast. So this is how libertarians view history. You have a legitimate choice between 2 branching options. Compatibilists say you don't really ever have 2 options, but you're doing what you want, and so that's kind of free will. So if we think about all this, right, you've got hard determinism, you've got soft determinism or compatibilism, which says determinism is true, but we've just kind of messed up the definition of free will. Free will just means doing what you desire, so they're compatible. And libertarianism says, no, free will means being morally responsible. It has to be up to you, truly, in the moment, up to you to be free. If God knows whether Garrett is going to cheat on his test tomorrow or not, can Garrett choose to do the other? If God knows Garrett's going to cheat, can Garrett choose not to cheat? And if not, does God's knowledge of our actions mean that we don't really have free will because it's already set, in God's mind at least?
So this is definitely like a really, probably the hardest question, because at least the way I learned it, the definition of libertarianism is there's no sufficient cause to determine choice. It's always going to be up to you. There's nothing that can make it 100% basically. There's things that can influence you to make it like, I want to do this more, but like nothing is sufficient to make you 100% do something. So by definition, that means that God can't make you 100% do something. And so that's interesting, because I think there is, like, my dad was kind of talking about some libertarians who are less strong libertarians who say like it exists, but there are things that can kind of control you. So there's a little bit of wiggle room there. But the real question is like, because depending on if you're a libertarian or soft determinist or compatibilist, kind of really depends on your views on God very heavily. And so one of the biggest problems with the main libertarian view is kind of how God interacts with his foreknowledge. It's that if we're all have libertarian choice, if we're just to say that it's God's nature to give us that libertarian choice, so it's not taking away from God's power. So we all have libertarian choice. We can do whatever we want, and God knows everything. It's like they use the analogy that he's looked into a crystal ball and he's seen everything that will happen in time. It's still up to us to make the choice, but he will see it in the crystal ball, and so he'll have foreknowledge. That seems to work at a surface level, but once you go down deeper, you begin to ask the questions that how does God then interact with his creation? Number one, like I said, he could interact, but could he really like have the power to make creatures with free will do what he wants? So that's the first question. And the second question is, if he sees what will happen in the future, it's the future, like there's just one future and he sees it. If he goes down to earth and interacts with someone to try to change their heart or something, if he changes, it's like the butterfly effect all over again in a way. If God changes someone or someone's choice, that will radically alter the future, and the future God will have known will no longer exist. There will be a new future. So by this logic, every time God interacts with the world, he's going to have to re-know the future because he'll have changed the future. So it's kind of like a logical impossibility at some levels.
There's to throw a little theology into the philosophy here, theologians look at God and says that God isn't past or future, he is eternal present. And so what's past is present to him, what's present is present to him, and what's future is present to him. And so that's how they work through some of the subtle confusions or disagreements or conflicts, however you want to put it, in that to speak of time with God, who lives in eternity without time constraint. It's difficult to speak of time when you speak of God. And so they say God lives in the eternal present. And so some of the things you were, great points you were bringing up, the theologian would say, that's a great
Some
point.
theologians.
Some theologians.
Some theologians.
Some theologians. The correct theologian. You can cut that out of the.
No, it's great. It's just, yeah.
Y'all are blowing my mind. So I'm not sure that I can speak to what you're talking about, but I was thinking that our entire faith is based on this mystery that God's plan was to have Jesus crucified to save us. And he worked within the system of our cause-effect world because he foreknew that Judas would betray, that the Pharisees would get angry. That's always been the mystery of, knowing their hearts and their choices, and they had a choice, and yet it was because of that motivation that led us to getting Jesus on the cross. And then it's real interesting because in Ladies' Study, we're watching The Chosen. And of course, they add to it the fiction and they give motivation to various characters, influences from family members, and you see Judas getting influences from other people, which maybe could have happened in their minds, right? So it's just kind of interesting to have your, to see how that works. But speak to it if you want to.
Yeah, well, so I like to kid with Bob, but no, my father-in-law Bob is absolutely right that is probably the most popular theological position. I just wanted to complicate it a little bit by putting out 3 possible options, because I think, like free will, time is one of the most difficult things to understand. And I think at least some philosophers think that idea of God not knowing something in advance because nothing is in advance for him is really complex philosophically, and that it could create some problems with how we understand God acting in history even. So the idea would be, we think God does things in time, right? Like he told Abraham, sacrifice Isaac, then when Abraham obeyed and went up the mountain, then he provided the ram, or whatever, right? So we believe God causes events, and those events happen in time. Some philosophers, at least, would say, if we think God is 100% purely non-temporal, atemporal, it doesn't make any sense for God to do anything in time. How could God interact with time if he is never in it? Or they would say, well, if it is still all, to me, in the future, whether I cheat on a test or not, but it is true in God's eternal, atemporal space, what that outcome is, I still can't change that. Like, is it really up to me what's true in God's eternal, atemporal, metaphysical space? So it is quite possibly true and been an incredibly popular answer. Just some philosophers think time is so hard to understand that we need to be really careful. So one other option, which I don't like, but I might as well admit my bias to you up front, is essentially the compatibilist option of saying, well, yeah, God already knows the future because everything is already fixed anyway. Like, it is just, the universe is one straight line. Everything is already determined, God knows it, and none of that changes the fact that we have free will, because free will is just acting in accordance with your desires. That's sort of the Calvinist answer, which is why I don't love it personally, so just to lay my cards on the table. But yeah, Calvinists would say, well, yeah, I mean, God knows the future, but it doesn't matter in terms of free will, because even if everything's determined, we still have free will. So that's one choice, is essentially the determinist, compatibilist kind of, God knows it in advance, but it doesn't matter that he knows it in advance, we're still free. The second is what Bob said, which is probably one of the most popular theologians' responses, is to say, well, God is atemporal, so he knows whether I'm going to cheat in advance, but he doesn't know it yesterday, because he doesn't know it with respect to time at all. Like, there is no past, present, or future, he just knows it. And therefore, it doesn't create a problem for knowing it in advance, because it's not related to time in any way. The third one, which I think is at least philosophically interesting, although I will admit it is theologically extremely controversial, is to say that God is all-knowing, which means he knows all things. But when it comes to human free choice about the future, there simply is nothing to know. There is no choice yet. So whether I cheat on my test tomorrow or not is not a thing. It's like, does God know the name of my pet unicorn? Well, no, he doesn't, but that doesn't limit God's knowledge in any way, because that's not a thing. It's sort of like when we talked about God's omnipotence, God's all-powerfulness, saying, can God create a square circle? Well, that's just a nonsense question or a logical contradiction. God has all the power in the universe, but power has nothing to do with whether you can make a square circle or not. So there are some what's called openness theologians or open theology that would say, once God created time, he entered into it to act in it. So the things I was saying about, talking to Moses, providing a ram, like God is acting within time now. And because he chose to give us free will, the decisions we will make in the future are non-existent right now. There's nothing to know. It's just nothing. It just doesn't exist. And therefore God knows all things, but my future free actions are not a thing. And so God doesn't know what I'll do. Now, most theologians get really queasy about any sentence that ever starts with God does not know, but the open theology will say, well, God knows everything that there is to know. That's just not a thing. That's like saying, does God know something that is false? He knows everything that's true, but my choices in the future are not true. They don't exist. So those are kind of the three paths, right? There's the Calvinist path, the open theology path, and the atemporal path. And I think philosophically they all have challenges, which is what makes this hard to understand. I don't know. Any other thoughts?
It's been a long time since I've given this a whole lot of thought. And when I did give it a whole lot of thought, I about drove me crazy because you keep going around.
You're welcome.
But I think in any environment, if you talk about like the laws of thermodynamics, they apply in a vacuum. If there are absolutely no outside influences or forces, those laws of thermodynamics are precisely the same. Like your pool example, if there's actually no change in temperature, humidity, Earth rotation, I don't know, solar flares, whatever, doing the exact same thing will result in the exact same laws. But that's not always the case, because there are influences outside that you don't account for. So, so from the standpoint of determinism, determinism isn't always consistent. I guess things may be determined, but it's not always consistent. I don't think.
Yeah. Okay. So let me see my thing about Epicurus that to me is at least interesting. I don't know if it relates or not, but so the ancient Greeks made up the term atom. Because and I can't remember if it was Epicurus himself or somebody before him, but they said matter has to be divisible and divisible and divisible until you get down to the smallest thing, which we can't even see, which is the smallest unit that maintains the properties of matter, and that is an atom. So I think it's interesting that 2,500 years ago or whatever, they came up with the idea of an atom. So when we discovered atoms, we said, oh, this must be the smallest thing. We called them atoms. Now, it turns out they're not actually the smallest because they've got protons and neutrons and stuff, but that's where we get the word atom. So Epicurus thought if the universe is made up of atoms that move in accordance with the laws of nature, like pool balls on a billiard table, then determinism must be true. But he refused to accept that determinism was true. Epicurus believed in free will, so he said atoms must occasionally swerve when they move. Instead of moving in a straight line, like when you hit a pool ball, it moves in a straight line, atoms have a random swerve. Now, I just think that's fascinating that he just thought about that 2,500 years ago, because a lot of physicists today think that there is something about at least the negative charge of atoms, electrons or whatever, that seems to be indeterminate. The fundamental nature of subatomic physics, there is an indeterminacy, that we can describe it statistically, but we can't predict it. And now I don't want to hang the hat of free will on that, because I don't think my free choice necessarily relates to like electrons moving randomly. But again, 2,500 years ago, he said there has to be indeterminate movement with atoms for there to be free will. How could he have possibly known, and yet most physicists today think that there is something indeterminate about atoms, the movement of electrons or whatever. So to me, that is at least interesting, right?
Yeah.
Well, even if you look at the atomic structure, you don't know the exact atomic structure. You have a probability of what that structure might be at a point in time,
Yeah.
but it's, even the structure of an atom changes constantly.
Yeah.
So I guess, kind of the conclusion I came to was that we were determined to have free will.
Thank you. Yeah. Appreciate that. Oh, goodness. All right. Well, I'm going to have to let Garrett go pretty soon to get over to the service. Any lingering questions or comments y'all want to be sure we get in today? Next week, I'm not going to be here. Jaren and I are celebrating our 22nd wedding anniversary, so we're going out of town. That was predetermined from the foundations of time that we would not be here. So I think Garrett will still be here. David will also be joining, so David will be filling in for my role next week. And then the 2 weeks after that, I think we're going to move on to ethics. So thanks for being here.
You have fun classes.
Yeah, but do you really want to talk about quantum physics, quantum mechanics?
Of course.
I said, probably.